The last bit became the source of a later rumor that Gallus had actually conspired with Cniva before the battle to ensure a Roman defeat. But given all the other circumstances of the battle and his later conduct, there is no reason to believe that Gallus had anything at all to do with the defeat at Abritus. The Battle of Abritus was one of the most shocking setbacks in Roman history. Though not quite as existentially terrifying as Cannae, the results of the battle still came as a mortal shock to the folks back home. The Emperor was dead, his army destroyed. Who or what is going to protect us now? Decius had set out to prove that the Romans were still the biggest kid on the block, and had wound up proving exactly the opposite. And this new Gothic terror filled the Romans with a dread they had not really felt since the days of Hannibal. How are we going to survive if our supposedly invincible legions are so easily destroyed? There was no ready answer, and the citizens of the Empire began to live with a fear in their hearts that they had never experienced before. Really, at that moment, it did not seem like the end was that far off. I want to end this week with a quick note on the tours. The first trip, as I already mentioned, is sold out, but we do have some space available on trips 2 and 3, which will run from May 17 to May 26, and from May 28 to June 7, respectively. It will be exactly the same itinerary, just over a different span of days. So if the first set of dates didn't work out for you, or you thought you had already missed your chance to go, then by all means, come along on one of the other trips. I should also note that we have removed the transatlantic airfare from the tour package. Once we started to get a feel for what would work out best for everyone, especially since so many international travelers will be along, it became obvious that the airfare to Rome and from Istanbul was more of a hindrance than a help to most people, so we made the decision to drop that part of the package. We will by all means help everyone make the proper arrangements, but just know that the price you see no longer includes those tickets. So, thehistoryofrometour.com. Act now because, as they said, good seats are still available, but won't be forever. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up The Rise and Fall of Alexandria, Birthplace of the Modern Mind, by Justin Pollard and Howard Reed, documenting the history of one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 111, Phase 1 complete. The Battle of Abritus forced the Romans to deal with something they had never before had to face: the death of an emperor in battle. Up until now, emperors had died of natural causes, or they had been assassinated, or they had committed suicide, but never had they fallen to an enemy's sword. The gods struck down emperors, or the Romans struck down emperors, or emperors struck down themselves. But they were not knocked off by some common barbarian warrior. It simply wasn't done. But while this humiliating blow to the national psyche was immense, the Romans did not have long to dwell on their misery, because there was one big practical problem the death of Decius had left them with. Who would rule now? The elevation of Decius' son Herennius to the rank of co-emperor just a few months earlier was supposed to have solved this problem, but he too had died at Abritus, leaving the empire not just without a leader, but without a leader in its darkest hour. To extract the empire from this predicament, the Senate and the army both came up with solutions to the problem of who would rule. Unfortunately, they were different solutions. The army naturally chose to elevate one of their own, specifically the senior-ranking officer left on the scene after the disaster at Abritus, Gaius Vibius Trebonianus Gallus. Back in Rome, though, the Senate chose to stick with the hereditary rights of Decius' family and elected Gaius Valens Hostilianus Messius Quintus, Decius' youngest son, who had been left behind in Rome while his father and brother had gone off to fight the Goths. The big justifiable fear after Decius' death was that some kind of civil war would break out, at a moment when a lack of internal unity might prove fatal. And with the Senate and armies backing separate candidates for the throne, that seemed to be the deadly path Rome was headed down. But the inevitable confrontation between Hostilian and Gallus never arrived, in part because Gallus decided that circumstances demanded that someone take the high road and offer a compromise. Sitting in a tent out near the Danube, surrounded by the remnants of an army that had just been annihilated by the Goths, Gallus recognized that this was no time for a civil war. If he wasted the time and energy of what was left of Decius' army on some power grab, the Goths could just sweep down, conquer the Middle Empire, and split Rome. He made it clear to the Senate that he planned to accept the army's acclaim. He also made it clear that he had no problem with Hostilian serving as his co-emperor. He was able to come to this magnanimous conclusion because, 1, he had always been on excellent terms with Decius and his family, and did not instinctively see Hostilian as a rival, and 2, the age difference between them, Hostilian was still a teenager, meant that Gallus would always be the senior Augustus. Accepting Hostilian, then, was more like accepting an heir than a true colleague. Plus, it's not like the Moesian legions were in any condition to force their demands on anyone. Though it seems a bit crazy to think about, Trebonianus Gallus was a rare figure at this point in Roman history. He was an emperor of fully Italian extraction. Since the fall of the Flavian dynasty, the imperial office had been populated by Spaniards and Africans and Thracians and Illyrians, but only on a few rare occasions was the Emperor of Rome actually an Italian. Now, of course, we can't read too much into this, as many of these emperors, the Trajans and Hadrians and Severans of the world, either came from Italian families transplanted into the provinces, or from provincial families who had married into important Italian clans. But still, it is worth noting that an emperor born in Italy to an Italian family had, by the 3rd century, become something of an endangered species. Gallus was born into a senatorial family of Etruscan origin, and had spent his life working his way up the cursus honorum, serving in civilian and military posts across the empire. At some point, he became an associate of Decius's, and when Decius became emperor, he immediately appointed Gallus to govern the province of Upper Moesia. The appointment underscores the close working relationship between the two men, as the governorship of Upper Moesia was no honorary ambassadorship to Tahiti. This was, after all, a territory not only being harassed by the Goths, but which had also been ground zero for the rebellion that had put Decius in power in the first place. The degree to which Decius trusted and respected Gallus is obvious, and the new governor quickly became trusted and respected by the men under his command as well. A full bronze statue of Gallus still exists that depicts a large, barrel-chested man with close-cropped hair, cutting an imposing figure. He was not some aristocratic dandy the Moesian legions could hope to push around. Not that they had time for such bullying. Gallus took over in 250 AD, and for the next 18 months he led the Roman response to the increasing Gothic raids. Sometimes he was successful, and sometimes he wasn't. But no one could argue that Gallus wasn't exerting maximum effort in an attempt to stem the barbarian tribe. When Cniva invaded with a full force, though, the Milesian legions were simply unable to do anything to stop him, and Gallus was one of those provincial leaders who told Decius in no uncertain terms that the lower Danube needed reinforcements and fast. He then served as one of Decius's key generals during the campaign against the Gothic king, and wound up being one of the few to escape from Abritus alive. As I said at the end of last week's show, Gallus took over what was left of the legions and came to an understanding with the victorious Cniva. The Romans would not hinder the Gothic retreat back across the Danube, and henceforth, payment would be made annually to the Gothic king to prevent him from attacking in the future. Though later Romans would castigate Gallus for this ignoble peace, modern scholars seem more than willing to give him a pass. He was in an incredibly difficult position, and doing the best he could to save the empire from further humiliation. The rumor that he and Cniva were in cahoots started up a few years later, but no one at the time, and no one now, really believes that those smears hold much water. The men of the Shattered Legions who had just elected him emperor certainly didn't think he was a traitor who had just gotten most of them killed. Otherwise, they would have torn him limb from limb, rather than giving him the keys to the empire. The peace deal with Cniva is evidence that Gallus was of a mind to walk the Romans away from the Battle of Abritus without making things any worse than they already were. But the external threat posed by the Goths was not the only source of potential peril. Gallus also had to make a choice about how to deal with the Senate's elevation of Hostilian. In this too, Gallus showed that he was more interested in making sure things didn't get worse than he was in just about anything else. So he sent a letter to the Senate informing them that their choice of Hostilian was a fine one, and that he would be happy to share the imperial insignia with the son of Decius. The Senate was no more disposed to start up a civil war than Gallus was, and immediately accepted the compromise. With the Goths temporarily sated, Gallus and a few key advisors made their way back to Rome to meet with Hostilian and the Senate, so that together they could work up for a plan on how to stabilize the empire, which was clearly teetering on the brink of something. When he arrived back in the capital, Gallus and Hostilian were acclaimed as co-Augusti of Rome, and Gallus' son Volusianus was named Caesar and eventual heir to the throne. The partnership between Gallus and Hostilian, though, wouldn't last the year. In the summer of 251, Hostilian mysteriously vanished from the historical record, and we can only guess at what happened to him. Gallus conspiracy theorists claim the young Augustus had been offed by the evil betrayer of Abritus, but the consensus opinion seems to be that Hostilian fell victim to a new plague that had chosen this inopportune moment to appear on the scene, the Cyprian Plague, so named because its effects were described in detail by Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage. As with the Antonine Plague, there is some debate over which particular disease ravaged the empire. As with the Antonine Plague, smallpox appears to be the likely culprit. If there is one recent cliché that I have really come to loathe, it is the cliché of the, quote,